Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're zooming in really sharply on a single mission.
Right.
We're going to analyze some very targeted, very high-stakes advice for a specific community navigating, well, one of the most competitive professional landscapes in the world, the UK.
And this isn't, your general career coaching. This is a strategic blueprint. It's designed to overcome some really specific hurdles.
Exactly. And the source of this advice is what makes it so credible, right?
It really is. We're looking at the Council of Ali Wasama, or Ali Somali. He's a business training consultant specialized in human capital management.
Based in the U.S., but his clients are global.
Absolutely. And his job isn't theory. He's training the gatekeepers. He works with huge corporate clients, helping them structure their HR, their talent acquisition.
Which means he knows what they're looking for. I saw he lists clients like Cambridge University, UCL.
Yep. So when he speaks, he knows exactly what that filter looks like from the inside. It makes his advice to Somali students and their parents brutally honest and, I think, very actionable.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got 3 key areas to unpack. First, the strategic educational paths he recommends.
Then the harsh reality of the UK job market and its biases.
And finally, some critical guidance he gives directly to parents about their role in all of this. The whole roadmap.
It is. It's built on this idea that preparation has to be academic, professional, and cultural all at once.
So let's start at that first fork in the road, right after secondary school. A student maybe doesn't have the grades to go straight to university. What does he say?
He lays out 3 really distinct options. The traditional one, of course, is go to sixth form, get your A-levels, and then head to university, the standard path.
But not everyone's ready for that, he argues.
Exactly. So alternative 1 is just go straight into employment, get some real-world experience, which, can be more valuable than a qualification you scraped by to get.
And the other alternative?
This is the one he really encourages. Seek an apprenticeship. Go to a big corporate company. You get qualifications while building a CV. It's a path that can lead back to university later or just straight into a career.
So how does a student choose between, say, an apprenticeship and the full university track? It seems to be less about grades and more about personality.
It's about an honest self-assessment. He says apprenticeships are for students who lack the inherent skills to go to university. And he doesn't mean intelligence.
He means discipline.
He means discipline, the ability to handle a long, self-directed academic program. If you struggle with that, an apprenticeship gives you structure and, as he puts it, quick access to the employment world.
And so universities for whom, then?
It's for the student who is, in his words, a reader, someone who genuinely studies hard, who is comfortable with theory, and has that discipline to commit for 3 years without someone holding their hand.
Okay, this brings us to his most, let's say, provocative advice on degrees. He claims the standard bachelor's degree is basically devalued now.
Completely. He says it's become like a secondary diploma.
Wow, a secondary diploma.
Yeah. I mean, think about it from his perspective. He's training HR managers. He sees the pile of CVs. So many people have a bachelor's now that it's not a filter anymore. It's just...
That's just table stakes, the price of entry.
Exactly. It just signals you're eligible to play.
So if the bachelor's is the new baseline, what does he say you need to actually be competitive?
4 years. That's the strong recommendation. 3 years for the bachelor's, and then you stay for 1 more and get a master's degree immediately.
Don't take a break.
Don't take a break. His logic is, if you have the momentum and discipline from the bachelor's, you have to capitalize on it. That immediate master's degree becomes the new competitive filter. It gets your CV past that first look.
Okay, let's pivot to the job market itself then. He makes it sound incredibly tough.
He says securing a job after graduation is extremely difficult. The market is just extremely competitive.
And he doesn't stop there. He gets very specific about the obstacles facing this particular community.
He does. He pulls no punches. He says, you're black, you're a Muslim. And he's clear that these 2 identity factors, they stack up against the individual. So you're not just facing competition, you're facing systemic friction.
And that awareness, that friction, leads to his most critical piece of advice about timing. We always tell students, focus on your finals.
Right. Worry about jobs later.
But he says that's a fatal mistake here.
It's a complete reversal of that advice. The mandate is clear. Do not wait until your 3rd year to look for work.
When then?
You have to start during your 1st or 2nd year of university, networking, internships, looking at graduate schemes, all of it.
That seems like a massive amount of pressure for a first-year student. Why so early?
Because of how the UK system works.
Yeah.
The biggest corporate graduate schemes, the ones with the best pay and training, they often close their applications in the autumn of the final year.
So by the time you're even thinking about it in your third year,
You've missed the window. You've missed the big opportunities. Starting in year one lets you build the CV, get the internships you need to even be considered for those top-tier jobs.
which brings us to his codification of the effort required, the really powerful statement.
It is. He says that to overcome all those stacked obstacles, Somali graduates have to work 10 times more.
10 times more. What does that even look like in practice?
It means, well, it means perfection. Your CV can't have a single typo. It means getting that master's. It means networking relentlessly outside your comfort zone. It implies that for every interview a mainstream graduate gets, you might have to send 10 applications just to get in the door. It's about non-negotiable overperformance just to get to the same starting line.
That need to overperform in the external world?
Yeah.
That won't matter if you're not ready for it culturally.
Or,
And this is where he brings in this idea of the bubble.
yes, the bubble. As he defines it, it's this sort of closed loop. Socially, commercially, he says the majority of the community lives, shops, and does business almost entirely within the Somali or maybe wider Asian community.
So they don't actually see the white community of the country. That's a direct quote.
Right. They don't encounter what he calls the real life of the UK. And while that insularity provides support, he argues it leaves graduates completely unprepared for what comes next.
Which is a kind of culture shock.
A severe culture shock. When they finally get a job, especially if it's outside of a diverse city like London, and they face friction or bias or even racism, they're shell-shocked. They haven't been socialized into the unspoken corporate rules or, frankly, built up the resilience to handle that hostility.
And what happens when they get that shock?
It often leads to retreat. He says the common reaction is to just resign, to say the company is racist, the people are racist, and just leave instead of finding a way to push through.
So he's framing it as a failure preparation almost,
Yeah.
that all that academic work is undermined.
He is. He's linking the isolation inside the community to a lack of professional resilience. The academic achievement becomes almost irrelevant if you can't survive the first bit of friction in the actual workplace.
So what's the implied advice there? How do you prepare for that? How do you pop the bubble before you graduate?
It's about exposure. It has to be intentional, taking part-time jobs outside the community, joining university clubs that are diverse, aggressively going for internships in mainstream corporate settings, even if they're unpaid. The goal is to build that social literacy and the emotional armor long before your actual career is on the line.
Let's turn to the role of parents in all this. This is where his advice gets, well, incredibly direct.
It's the most forceful part of his analysis, for sure. He uses this extreme language, saying Somali parents are the most difficult parents on the planet when it comes to education.
That's a staggering claim. How does he justify it?
Well, he says it's not just him. He's reporting what he hears from people inside the education system. That includes Somali teachers.
Really?
Yes. And the core issue, the reason teachers are reluctant to even call the parents, comes down to one dynamic.
And what is that?
The parents, he reports, will always automatically side with their child against the teacher, no matter what. The teacher is always wrong and the child is always right.
So there's no partnership there. The teacher can't provide corrective feedback because they know it's going to be a hostile conversation.
Exactly. It's completely counterproductive, and it stunts the child's growth because there's no external accountability.
He then expands this into a critique of the whole parenting style.
He does. He says the parenting style is often extremely soft. And that softness, he argues, reinforces the lack of discipline he was talking about earlier. The very discipline you need for university and for that 10 times more work ethic.
So if the diagnosis is extremely soft, what's the prescription?
To be stricter, to actively guide children, set firm boundaries, demand structure. It's about moving away from, in his words, giving in to the needs of the children. The structure at home has to mirror the rigor of the world they're about to enter.
It's interesting, though, that in the middle of all this really tough internal critique, he does shout out one organization he thinks is doing good work.
He does. He gives a really specific endorsement to something called the Trailblazer Project. He calls it a great one and says it's doing important work.
Which suggests he sees a solution in these kinds of structured external support systems, mentorship bridging that gap.
Absolutely. It's not all on the parents or the students alone. There's a role for community organizations to help build that bridge.
So after all of that, what does this mean for you, the listener? The big takeaway seems to be that success in this kind of environment requires an almost military-grade strategic approach.
I think so. It means the master's is the new minimum. It means your job hunt starts the day you start university. And it means being mentally prepared to work 10 times harder just to get to parity.
It really highlights this core conflict, doesn't it? The
Yeah.
tension between the comfort and safety of a tight-knit community.
And the really hard, sometimes painful preparation you need to succeed in a wider professional world that isn't always welcoming. Success depends on actively bridging that gap, moving from a culture of protection to one of, I guess, aggressive preparation.
Right. It's confronting that internal comfort with the external reality. So that leaves us with a final thought. If a lack of exposure causes this shell shock that can derail a promising career, undermining years of work, how can communities balance that strength of cultural identity with the absolute necessity of engaging with the messy, difficult, diverse realities of the mainstream professional world before graduation? The preparation isn't just about A-levels and degrees, it's about resilience.
A tough question, but a vital one for parents and students to be asking.
That's all for this deep dive. Thank you for listening.